This video will explore the Gilded Age Gramercy Mansion of Maryland and its ghosts. In this video, we will learn not only about Gramercy Mansion and its inhabitants, including the Brewster family, but the other Gilded Age mansions of Maryland's horse country. In 1902, railroad baron Alexander Cassatt bought a heavily wooded piece of property in Green Spring Valley, Maryland, outside of Baltimore, containing 45 acres of the present Gramercy Mansion. This was to be a wedding present for his daughter, Eliza, known as Elsie Cassatt, who married stockbroker William Plunkett Stewart in January 1902 in Philadelphia. Plunkett was born in Baltimore in 1878, making him 24 at the age of his first marriage. Under the leadership of his brother Redmond, he was one of the schoolboys who started the second oldest steeplechase race in Maryland. He was also the founder of the still existing Green Spring Valley Hunt Club. His father-in-law, Alexander Cassatt, was famous in his day as the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Cassatt farm Kelso still stands in Pennsylvania and is now a YMCA. You can learn more about it on this channel in the Gilded Age playlist. Today, Cassatt's fame is overshadowed by his sister, Mary Cassatt, who was an Impressionist painter. Her niece, Eliza, appears in some of her work. Eliza's father, Alexander, was born in 1839 and died in 1906. He was a generous father and wanted to give his daughter a magnificent wedding present. What better than a new home for the newlyweds? Gramercy Mansion was built to resemble Cassatt's summer home, 4 acres, on the ocean in Bar Harbor, Maine. In the style of an Old English Tudor manor house with external beams, the mansion had 25 rooms. Construction on the property also included an 18-horse stall carriage house, an ice pond, an ice house 40 feet deep to hold ice, a barn, and creamery. The foyer, living room, and parlor of the mansion have American chestnut panels. The library has cherry wood. The historic tile above its fireplaces in the library, dining room, and parlor is Moravian tile. These are some of the very first Art Nouveau tile produced in the United States. The chandelier hanging in the foyer was purchased in Turkey for $800 and has a pulley to raise and lower it. The myth is that Eliza died in 1906 before Gramercy Mansion was completed. But this is false. It was her father, the commissioner of Gramercy Mansion, who died in December 1906. Eliza had 3 siblings. Her older brother was a soldier and horse breeder, Edward B. Cassatt. Her mother's uncle was United States President James Buchanan. As a child, Eliza visited her painter aunt in France and was the subject of portraits including Catherine Cassatt reading to her grandchildren, Elsie in a blue chair, and Elsie Cassatt holding a big dog. Elsie Cassatt was described as a young woman whose every curve speaks of her athletic training and fine physical condition. A modern Diana, she rides, swims, shoots, and plays tennis. She was also known as a cricketer and serious golfer before she married. She played in the U.S. Women's Amateur in 1899, medals of which still exist, and in 1901. She was considered one of the top American women golfers of her day. She was a member of the Marion Cricket Club with her sister Catherine in 1900. She loaned some of her Aunt Mary Cassatt's paintings to a major exhibit held at the Pennsylvania Museum in 1927. But she divorced her husband in 1930 and he remarried the next year. William Stewart was a noted breeder of hunting dogs and horses. Their daughters were Catherine, Doris, and Elsie. Their only son, Alexander, named after Elsie's father, died in 1912, probably in Philadelphia. Eliza died in New York in 1931, aged 55, right after her divorce. Stewart remarried Carol Harriman in 1931. Harriman was also a lover of horses and bred the horse Pasteurized, which won the 1938 Belmont Stakes. Eliza moved back to Pennsylvania after her divorce, to houses built by her father, including Cheswold of Haverford, Pennsylvania. Her gravesite is in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania. Her daughter Catherine Kelso Stewart married Eric Vicomte de Spolbroek, a Belgian pilot, in 1932. The Elsie Cassatt Stewart Memorial Children's Fund was established at the Jefferson Medical College Hospital in Philadelphia. The Stewart family moved to Philadelphia at some point, and the property was sold to Mr. and Mrs. Landstreet in 1907. One wonders if Stewart brought his second wife into his first wife's home, built for him by his father-in-law, since his second marriage so closely followed his first divorce. Was Pasteurized the horse named for the creamery of Gramercy Mansion? For whatever reason, perhaps stemming from this acrimonious first couple, Gramercy Mansion would continue to be unlucky for its female inhabitants. Felix S. Landstreet was the vice president of the Western Maryland Railroad. His wife was the niece of a West Virginian senator. The Landstreets lived at Gramercy Mansion for 5 years before selling it to industrialist Benjamin H. Brewster in 1912. The Landstreets purchased the Gilded Age home at a time of expansion for the Western Maryland Railroad, which is now simply a sightseeing tourist rail. The Landstreets were likely known to the Cassatts due to the railroad connection. In 1907, the Western Maryland Railroad, with the guidance of robber baron Jay Gould, and you can learn more about his family on this channel, acquired several railroad companies, including the Georges Creek and Cumberland Railroad, which had built a line west through the Cumberland Narrows. Using the portion of the line through the Narrows, an extension was built, starting in 1910, and it was completed in 1912 to Connellsville, Pennsylvania. At Connellsville, the Western Maryland connected with the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie Railroad, so well known to Alexander Cassatt. So perhaps in 1912 it was necessary for the Longstreets to be back in Pennsylvania, and that's why they sold the property. Benjamin H. Brewster, Jr., the next owner of Gramercy Mansion, was the only child of U.S. Attorney General Benjamin Harris Brewster, Sr., originally of New Jersey, and Mary Walker, the great-great-granddaughter of Benjamin Franklin. Brewster Sr. can be considered a sort of turncoat to the South due to his switching of sides during the Civil War. Much of Maryland was pro-South. Brewster Jr. was born in 1872 and died in 1941. He was the father of Captain Daniel Baugh Brewster, and he adopted the children of a sugar plantation owner from his wife's first marriage, Andre DeLande Brewster and Robert DeLande Brewster. The Brewster family lived at Gramercy. Brewster Jr. would have welcomed his son, Captain Daniel Baugh Brewster, in the United States Marines to the home. Captain Brewster was married to Ottilie Young Brewster, and it is she who seems to be the ghost of Gramercy. Ottilie had many children, accounts vary as to if it was 5 or 6, with her first husband, Captain Daniel. Daniel Jr. in November 1923 was born the very year of their marriage, and potentially Ottilie was pregnant at the time of her wedding. Daniel Brewster Jr., or Danny, would become an American senator and the so-called golden boy of Maryland politics. Catherine Ottilie was born in 1927 and Elizabeth Baugh in 1930. These children ran around the grounds of their grandfather's home, Gramercy Mansion, in their youth, and may have learned to ride horses from its carriage house. But in 1934, their father, Captain Daniel, was dead at the age of 37 from a heart attack brought on by alcoholism. Danny was only 10 years old. Imagine the pressure on Ottilie. Her father-in-law was an only son, and her husband was an only son biologically of the Brewster family, and now she was responsible for continuing the Brewster name and legacy in her son. She paid close attention to his social affairs her whole life. Ottilie is photographed with short, dark, curly hair and in flapper wear. In 1923, when she married Captain Daniel, she was 20 years old, and at age 31, she was a widow. According to the Gramercy Mansion website and its current owner, Miss Anne, there were 2 encounters with a flapper ghost that we are aware of. She recalled, "There was a very nice couple staying in the Blue Garden Suite many, many years ago. They were in their 40s. Everything was going great during their stay until they had an unexpected yet completely harmless visitor. When the man descended the staircase for breakfast the next morning, he was nervous and slightly shaking. He told me, 'I don't know how to tell you this. I really don't know how to say this because I am not that kind of person. But this morning I saw a ghost. I was shaving in front of the mirror in the bathroom when I saw the reflection of a woman walk by. She had on a long dress and a hat covered her short and curly dark-colored hair. All the while my wife was packing her suitcase in the other room. To ensure I wasn't seeing things, I asked my wife if she had walked by. She hadn't. The man also explained that he had seen flashes of light in the living room of the suite throughout the night. In all of my time living in the mansion, I had never experienced any of this, and was surprised to hear about it. This was the first guest to ever mention any ghost encounters at Gramercy. After this occurrence, time passed. Anne's son also saw flashes of light in the Blue Garden Suite during his stay, but did not see any ghosts. More time passed, and a year and a half had gone by from the first experience when another experience was shared. 2 clairvoyants were staying in the Blue Garden Suite. They saw a ghost floating in the back room of the suite. The pair described the ghost as wearing a long dress with a hat covering her short and curly dark-colored hair, same as the other sighting. When they descended the staircase for breakfast the next morning, they were delighted by their experience. I was told they received good vibes from the spirit and that she was very nice. Again, I have yet to encounter any spirits or ghosts in the mansion, and I have lived here for over 20 years. While Miss Anne and her husband Ron have not experienced any ghost encounters themselves and still live in the mansion to this day, there's no proof that the other reports happened or did not happen. With hundreds of people staying in the Blue Garden Suite annually, there have been no recent reports of any unusual activity. The Gramercy Mansion hosts at least 100 events annually, including weddings, elopements, and meetings. Could the ghost be Ottilie? Ottilie could no longer call Gramercy Mansion home after her mother-in-law sold the property to the Hoffmans in 1941. Ottilie's father-in-law died that same year. She had an eye on education for her children, especially her son. Danny was raised in comfort on a beautifully appointed farm in Maryland fox hunting country. The Washington Post described Danny as an inheritor of the Baugh chemical fortune. He was educated at the Gilman School in Baltimore City and at St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire. He attended Princeton and Johns Hopkins University, before the American entry into World War II. Like his father, he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in 1942 and carried his father's Colt 45 into battle. During World War II, he served in the Pacific Theater, participating in the Battle of Guam and the Battle of Okinawa. For his actions during the war, he received a Bronze Star, but he didn't have the desire for war like his father did. He was wounded 7 times, receiving a Purple Heart and a Gold Star. He left active duty in 1946 and became moody after his service, but continued in the reserve until 1972, reaching the rank of colonel. What is the significance of Danny's Princeton education? In 1939, 8 years after her first husband's death, and when her son was 18 years old, poised to enter college, Ada Lee married a Princeton professor, William Francis Cochran III, 3 years her junior. He was the son of a fervent socialist. He died after 7 years of marriage in 1946. At this time, Ada Lee was single again and lived until 1989, involving herself and passing judgment on members of her son's social circle. She is buried in St. Thomas Episcopal Church of Baltimore, Maryland, the same church as that of her second husband's family and of her first husband's grave. Ada Lee's sons' marriages would also have problems. By Brewster's own admission, he was an alcoholic by his 30s. The Democrat Brewster, who would become Nancy Pelosi's mentor, was elected to the Maryland House of Delegates in 1950. At age 26, he was one of the youngest members of Maryland's state legislature in history. He mixed in the leisure class of Maryland and fell for Ann Bullitt of the prominent Biddle family, who have a street named for them in Baltimore. Before his deployment in World War II, he and Anne were engaged, but she would reappear in his life years later after his first marriage, and they actually died the same year. Brewster served in the House of Delegates until 1958. In 1954, he married his first wife, Carol Leiper de Havenin, and they were divorced in 1967. They had 2 children. Danny reconnected with Anne at her father's funeral and married her in 1967. He and she divorced in 1969, and she moved to Ireland to raise horses, where the IRS was sure to follow her and sued her for unpaid taxes later in her life. Her fantastic Cartier diamond necklace was recently auctioned off for more than $500,000. According to Danny's account, his drinking began to spiral out of control in 1964. Alcoholism probably lost him his Senate race in 1968, and by 1969 he was drinking with a vengeance and almost died following an alcoholic collapse. He sought inpatient rehab multiple times and became sober in 1973. In 1976, he married Judy Lynn Arsond after meeting her at an alcohol treatment facility. The couple had 3 children, who joined Danny's 2 other children from his first marriage. Danny's career seemed poised for great things due to his military career, his family money, and his closeness with President John F. Kennedy. He was tapped as a potential successor to the psycho Lyndon B. Johnson. Brewster helped pass the Civil Rights Act, perhaps relying on his mixed family with his father's sugar plantation brethren. One of the rooms of Gramercy Mansion is called Camelot, but the Zionist forces against Kennedy would not cease. In 1964, Brewster ran in the Democratic presidential primaries against segregationist Governor George Wallace. As Lyndon B. Johnson refused to run nationally, his so-called favorite sons were run in his place against Wallace, including Matthew Welsh of Indiana and John Reynolds of Wisconsin. Brewster won Maryland's primary but was embarrassed by Wallace's showing of 43%. Brewster barely carried his own Baltimore County. The people wanted segregation, and Brewster ignored them. Since this decision, Baltimore has descended into chaos and malaise, with 90% of Baltimore students not proficient in math. In 1969, Brewster was indicted on 10 criminal counts of solicitation and acceptance of bribes while a United States Senator, as well as 2 counts of accepting illegal gratuities. The charges stemmed from a campaign contribution by Spiegel Incorporated, a mail order firm. Brewster maintained his innocence. At trial, the judge dismissed 5 of the charges, saying Brewster's actions were protected under the speech or debate clause of the United States Constitution. That is, political bribes were free speech. The prosecution disagreed and appealed directly to the United States Supreme Court, which heard the case in 1971 and 1972. In June 1972, that court held 6-3 in United States v. Brewster that the taking of illegal bribes was not protected speech because taking a bribe is not part of the performance of a legislative or political function. The charges were reinstated. Brewster stood trial and was found not guilty of the bribery charges, but was convicted of accepting an unlawful gratuity without corrupt intent. However, in August 1974, his conviction was overturned on appeal due to the trial judge's improper instructions to the jury. In 1975, Brewster pled no contest to a single misdemeanor charge of accepting an illegal gratuity and was fined and allowed to keep his law license. The government dropped the other charges after 5 years of legal effort. After leaving the Senate, Brewster took up farming in Glendon, Maryland. As of 1978, he operated his farm, worked as an alcoholism counselor at a veterans hospital, led the Governor's Advisory Council on Alcoholism, and worked at a quarter-way house in Baltimore. Shortly before his death in 2007, speaking to Capitol News Service, he described fond memories with Nancy Pelosi, saying Pelosi, who worked as a receptionist for him, was an excellent front person. Let's look more into Brewster and his life at Gramercy Mansion via some excerpts from John Frece's biography about him, Self-Destruction. The foreword to this book was written by Nancy Pelosi, who calls Maryland her beloved, raising questions as to whether her destruction of California was deliberate. Calling herself Brewster's good friend, Pelosi worked in Brewster's office for years. Do we see the kind of suicidal empathy from progressives begin with Brewster? He was self-destructive like other men in his family, but he carried his noblesse oblige from the Gilded Age as well. Let's learn more. Although most of his fellow Marines surely never knew it, Lieutenant Daniel B. Brewster was a trust fund baby. Brewster came from inherited wealth on both sides of his family, a family of privilege and connections, of accomplishments and lineage. We didn't really have chores, Danny's youngest brother, Walter Wicks Brewster, recalled. Oh, we would hang up our clothes, but we didn't make the bed. Pearl made the bed. Her husband was the butler, Hawkins. We had a cook named Vera. Walter recounted that upstairs at Fernwood, the estate where he and Danny and their siblings grew up, near the bedrooms, was not only a pressing room where the ironing was done, but a separate room dedicated to the household seamstress. Walter also remembered he and his twin sister, Betty Baugh, had bars on their windows, installed at the insistence of his grandmother as a safety precaution, that wealthy families sometimes took after the 20-month-old son of aviator and nationalist Charles Lindbergh was kidnapped and murdered in 1932. Our bedrooms were right over the front porch, and someone could take a ladder and come up there, Walter said. Danny Brewster's father went to Gilman, like Danny, and then to Princeton. Before Danny entered World War II, he went to Gilman, St. Paul's, and Princeton. This path was not dedicated. It was a tradition, a way of life. The Brewster who found himself under fire in an Okinawan rice paddy in World War II was a direct descendant of the founding father Benjamin Franklin. His ancestors also included Robert John Walker, who was a United States Senator from Mississippi, and briefly the governor of Kansas. Nathaniel Brewster was a member of the very first graduating class in 1642 at Harvard. Danny's great uncle, Major General Andre Walker Brewster, was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions during the anti-imperialist Boxer Rebellion in China in 1900. We were never allowed to pick up a drumstick or lamb chop with our fingers, Walter Brewster recalled, and there was no cussing. Danny never swore. I don't ever remember him telling a dirty joke. I think they taught them that at the St. Paul's School. They were taught that people who talked dirty weren't educated because they didn't have the right adjectives. Families in the Brewster circle were affluent enough to engage in serious philanthropy and extensive permanent land preservation, noblesse oblige. Children were brought up to be educated, cultured, polite, with nothing but the best manners. A particular favorite for many refined young Green Spring Valley girls was the Foxcroft School because of its excellent horseback riding program. Horses were and still are central to everything in the Green Spring Valley of Maryland, and also in the neighboring Worthington and Western Run valleys, all north of Baltimore. The horses were thoroughbreds, and most were steeplechase racers, trained to jump the high timber fences at the My Lady's Manor, the Grand National, and the most prestigious steeplechase race of them all, the Maryland Hunt Cup, often billed as the world's toughest timber race. Both Danny's father and his grandfather of Gramercy Mansion held the prestigious position of Master of Foxhounds for the Green Spring Valley Hounds. It is all about the chase, and it is the hounds that lead the horses and riders over and through fields, fences, and tree lines until the fox finally goes to ground. Brewster's father became an expert on the breeding of foxhounds, bringing English hounds to the States and crossing them with American hounds. He kept a handwritten record that included the family trees of various dogs as if they were aristocracy. The whole Brewster family was deeply enmeshed in the valley's horse culture. After World War II ended, Worthington Farms was purchased by Danny and his first wife, Carol Leiper. Carol was from a prominent old-line Philly family and was an accomplished horsewoman. Fate may have put their purchase of the farm in play years before, when in 1922, the year the Hunt Cup first ran at Worthington Farms, Danny's father completed in a field that included Carol's father. This lifestyle was due to family wealth. The Brewster family fortune grew from two streams. Brewster's grandmother was Catherine Osborne Young, daughter of Otto Young, a fabulously rich Illinois businessman. Young, or Jung as it was originally spelled in his native Prussia, immigrated to New York and made his way to Chicago. There, at the end of the 19th century, he was a jewelry merchant, but he made a fortune by buying up and redeveloping downtown property devastated by the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. He became rich enough that in 1886 he acquired half interest in the famous Chicago World's Fair. Danny's maternal side owned the Marble Palace on the shores of Wisconsin's Lake Geneva. His daughter, Catherine Osborne Young, eloped with Byron Frank Hobart, Jr. in 1902. Her father was not amused, and the marriage was quickly dissolved, allegedly after Otto Young paid young Hobart possibly as much as $200,000 to quietly disappear. Before he did, however, the couple produced a daughter, Catherine Ottilie Hobart. Decades later, Ottilie would become Danny's mother. She was raised in the home of Dr. Walter Wicks, whom her mother remarried. This physician turned stockbroker was met by the family in Chicago, and they had been early settlers along the Chester River in Kent County on Maryland's eastern shore. Together, they hired an architect to design a suitable residence for their new Green Spring Valley Road property. They built a massive Tudor-style structure modeled on England's medieval Warwick Castle. They named it Wycliffe. It had 65 rooms and 17 bedrooms, each with its own bathroom, including bedrooms for some of the family's 17 full-time servants. Not even the Widener mansion, Linwood, with the largest facade in Pennsylvania, had this. The stone fortress was rimmed at the top with battlements. The castle, seemingly out of place, featured turrets and a tall central tower, carved crimson chimneys, dark wood paneling, lead-paned and stained glass windows, and a carriage porch, as well as a pool, lake, tennis court, stables, and more. Ottilie, their eldest daughter, was given the Wicks name, and soon she was joined by multiple half-siblings. The Wickses were neighbors to the Brewsters. It was fertilizer that grew the Brewsters' paternal side of family wealth. In 1817, Danny Brewster's great-great-grandfather, John Pugh Baugh, began manufacturing what became one of the oldest established fertilizer lines in the United States. He crushed cow bones together and imported guano from Peru to be processed and resold as fertilizer. Incorporated as Baugh and Sons Company in 1855, the firm moved to Philly where it built a factory on the eve of the Civil War. The fertilizer was said to improve grazing pastures for cattle, and it had proven success with farmers growing wheat, corn, alfalfa, potatoes, string beans, rye, strawberries, tobacco, asparagus, and oats. Factories in North Carolina followed the initial factory in Philadelphia. The well-known logo of the House of Baugh depicted a side view of a skeletal bull with horns. It was the Baugh Fertilizer Company that brought Danny's grandparents from Philadelphia to the Green Spring Valley in 1912, where they bought Gramercy Mansion just west of Wycliffe. Brewster was the wealthy president of the Baugh Companies and needed to be closer to the family's fertilizer business in Baltimore. Another property was bought, Scrooby Manor, a name that came from the British home of a passenger on the Mayflower named Elder Will Brewster. Although he was related, Danny was not a direct descendant of the Mayflower Brewster. Families such as the Brewsters and other well-to-do families in the valleys north of Baltimore married their offspring into similarly situated families, not unlike American royalty. After World War I ended, young Daniel Baugh Brewster returned home to Scrooby Manor and reconnected with his childhood neighbor, Ottilie. They saw each other at parties at Wycliffe Castle, which had become the dazzling center of social life in the Green Spring Valley. Among the guests attending at least one party there was F. Scott Fitzgerald of The Great Gatsby, who had been a student with Brewster at Princeton. Were the recollections of this young, starry couple captured in Fitzgerald's many short stories? Both Brewster and Fitzgerald's were members of an eating club known as the Cottage Club until Fitzgerald, who was a class ahead of Brewster, went off to World War I. After Prohibition began in 1920, the Whigs threw parties at Wycliffe, during which alcohol was openly served. Family members recalled how the illicit booze was stashed away in secret cabinets later found in the paneled walls, behind a storage closet wall, and even in a drop ceiling in the parlor. There were rumors, never confirmed, of a tunnel under the castle through which the liquor was delivered. In February 1923, Daniel Bob Brewster married his neighbor, Ottilie Hobart Wicks. They moved to an estate named Fernwood. Brewster and Ottilie were within walking distance of both sets of parents, as well as Brewster grandparents at Gramercy Mansion. One would assume, with so many servants, that the Brewster boys and I would have led a very pampered, sheltered life. It was, to a certain extent, recalled Francis Ike Eaglehart, who lived at Ivy Hill, another Gilded Age mansion. But we were allowed to roam freely around the three properties, fishing, catching turtles, squirrel hunting with 22s, and endangering ourselves and others near us as we approached the 4th of July. The boys hunted fox and rabbits together with a pack of beagles and learned to horseback ride as early as the age of 8. Toward the middle of 1934, in May 1934, Brewster's father, a vice president of the Fidelity Trust Company and a trustee of the Gilman School, suddenly died at Fernwood of what newspapers described as a heart attack. He was 37 and left a wife and 5 children. What the neighbors did not report, and the newspapers did not report, but what family members believe, is that Danny's father's heart attack was caused by alcoholism and the injection of a drug called paraldehyde, which was used to treat the side effects of alcoholism, specific seizures. Paraldehyde was historically used to induce sleep in sufferers from delirium tremens, and it can be taken orally or via injection. Delirium tremens is a severe form of alcohol withdrawal that can cause confusion or involve sudden and severe mental or nervous system changes. Paraldehyde was generally considered a safe drug, but overdoses can lead to lack of consciousness and coma. Brewster's death certificate stated that the cause was acute dilation of the heart. This can occur as a reaction to a drug in its inflammation used either illicitly or as part of a medical treatment. Who was injecting Danny's father with the drug? Was Ottilie responsible for such injections, or was Danny's father injecting himself around the rooms of Gramercy Mansion as well as the other Gilded Age mansions mentioned? Bottom line, he drank himself to death with a possible assist from an agent given to him. Jerry L. Brewster wrote of his grandfather's death in a letter to his father, Danny, and to other family members in 2004. This would not be the only time the Brewster family would be afflicted by the myriad problems associated with alcoholism. With his father's death, Danny Brewster, at age 10, suddenly became the man of the house, and his father's image loomed before him. Brewster Sr. had dropped out of Princeton to join the fighting in France during the First Great War, and Danny wanted to do the same. "You know, I went off to war and I didn't care if I got killed or not," Brewster confided decades later to his Senate staff. He had a routine first semester at Princeton and played on the freshman football squad, potentially inspiring F. Scott Fitzgerald. Norman B. Nash, the school's headmaster, wrote Danny's mother, Ottilie, to express his concern about the desire of some of the boys to enter military service. "Danny asked me what my advice would be, and I told him that I thought the country did not need 18-year-old soldiers or sailors, and that my own military experience, including a year in France, led me to believe men of 21 and upward were much better soldiers, especially as officers, since the immaturity of the younger men stood in their way in handling the men under their command, Nash wrote, adding that he advised Danny to stay at St. Paul's to finish his final year. For Brewster, the fatherless teenager, the students at St. Paul's became his brothers, and the faculty members, known as masters, became his surrogate parents. He finished his final year with honors. It was at the age of 19 in June 1943 that he was commissioned a second lieutenant and assigned as an instructor at the Marine Training Base in Quantico, Virginia. By the time he arrived there, he had another serious interest, and her name was Anne Moen Bullitt. Bullitt grew up worldly and sophisticated beyond her years. She considered her father to be a god. She was fluent in French and spent teenage summers in Paris with her father. At the age of 15, in 1939, she was out in society. The Brewster and Bullitt families moved in the same social circles, so they could have met at vacations in Hobie Sound or at Audley's summer vacations in Northeast Harbor, Maine, where so many residents from eastern Pennsylvania families visited that it was nicknamed Philadelphia on the Rocks. In late summer 1943, Danny drove 80 miles from Quantico to Baltimore County to attend a party on his home turf at the Green Spring Valley Hunt Club. Kitty Wicks, his aunt, drove Anne Bullitt to the party from Washington, and almost immediately Anne and Danny began seeing each other at every opportunity. On August 7th, I proposed most successfully, Danny recorded. Everything was perfect. We were very much in love and wanted to get married in the near future. I was happy and did not even regret being stationed at Quantico. Anne Bullitt and Danny Brewster made a good-looking couple. People noticed he kept his hazel eyes focused on whomever he was conversing with, and for Danny that was often Anne. They were the polished offspring of the same well-to-do social set, sharing a love of horses and riding, and whose youthful ages belied their cultivated worldly outlooks. Their engagement was announced in October 1943, and the announcement was in every paper in the country. A notice even appeared in Time magazine. Then came the change, Danny said. In late October, Anne told him she wasn't so sure. I was wild, Danny said. It was difficult, he remembered. She acted like a little kid. But then he never showed that force and determination that I believe is so essential. I begged, I let her do whatever she wanted, and was content to hang on, in the hopes that matters might turn out all right. Brewster's heart-sick mother, Audley, wrote him at Quantico to say how sorry she was to hear in November 1943 things still seemed to be at sixes and sevens between you and Anne. She advised him not to marry Anne unless everything is all cleared up. Maybe it's Charlie Bartlett, she suggested, referring to a young Yale graduate who dated Anne and who years later became famous as the man who introduced Jackie Bouvier to John F. Kennedy. Brewster's mother, Audley, also wondered whether Anne has realized that you haven't enough money to keep her as she has been accustomed, an assertion that ignores the Brewsters were wealthy in their own right, but on a different scale from the Bullitt-Biddle family. Maybe Anne is getting temperamental like her mother, Audley added, referring to the iconoclastic Louise Bryant. You don't want to marry a neurotic. It would be hell for you. In December, Anne and Danny broke up. Anne gave back a ring, a pin, and his mother's watch, but Danny insisted she keep the pin to remember him. As far as the future is concerned, let it take care of itself, Danny said. I meant my last words to Anne. I will look her up again. I hope she is waiting, but I won't care if she isn't. I am not in love with her now, not even close, but there is something inside me that continually causes me to think of her. If I had to bet my life on it, one way or the other, I would say that someday I will marry that girl." He was right. Not long after Danny was born in 1923, his father presented his firstborn son with a uniquely personal gift, his Croix de Guerre with a bronze palm, the medal presented to Brewster Sr. by the French government for extraordinary heroism during World War I. Father and son shared a love of horses, fox hunting, and the lifestyle of the gentleman farmer. They both attended Gilman and Princeton, and both dropped out of Princeton to fight for their country in different world wars. Both had great pride in being a Marine. Both men were wounded, and both were decorated for unselfish gallantry in battle. Both surely were affected by what they witnessed in combat, with Danny Brewster forever regretting that he supported the Vietnam War. Both men married well, but their relationships with their children were often distant. Both men had issues with alcohol, and both relished the social life of the Green Spring Valley. But there was a difference between Danny and his father. "I have been over the top twice, and God willing I shall go over every time the Marines go over, but I don't like it, and you can take my word for it," Danny wrote to Ottilie after the battle. "Anybody that says he is fond of it is a damned liar. This thing changes a man." But this is totally different from his father's review of World War I. He wrote in 1918, "The men work like hell, cheerfully and willingly, and come back singing and cheering like hell every night. I tell you, I am mighty proud to be a Marine officer. The quarters and food are excellent. The French had welcomed the American troops with open arms, and he could not possibly be happier." Was this a change between the two men, or a change between the two world wars, or both? The next owners of Gramercy Mansion, the Hoffmans, who had purchased the home from the Brewsters, lived there for 8 years. They sold the estate in 1950 to the Cannonia Foundation. Like many charitable functions worldwide, Cannonia was started by Christians. The Cannonia Foundation was created by a group of 12 Christians who, in the aftermath of World War II, wanted to spread the gospel. Their leaders recruited students who were taught organic agriculture and literacy skills, as well as techniques on coping with language barriers, differences in religion, politics, and attitudes, a somewhat globalist endeavor. These missionaries went abroad instead of focusing on their own community, which was rapidly devolving in the years after World War II. The demise of Cannonia as a missionary center came after the creation of the Peace Corps via the federal government in 1961, which made many religious groups like Cannonia obsolete. The Peace Corps mirrored many of the aims the Cannonia Foundation created. In the 1960s, Cannonia changed its focus. A new age mentality arose, and the foundation became tied to ideals of spiritual discovery and growth. The center taught yoga, meditation, organic gardening, art, dance, music, and psychology. This new age eventually faced bankruptcy, necessitating the sale of the estate. At this time, Gramercy Mansion had fallen into neglect, and the house was sold at auction to Dr. Ronald and Ann Pomicala in 1985. The property was abandoned, and in such a state the Pomicalas had to replace 80% of its structural beams. But they retained the agricultural integrity of the 45-acre grounds, and produce grown at Gramercy is sold in Whole Foods, Giant, and Grawls on the eastern shore of Maryland. The Baltimore Symphony Orchestra donated wallpaper to the revamp, reflecting the value of what can happen when a community comes together to save a building, as has been done for the wonderful Gramercy Mansion.